conquer continent, a country barely 70 years old and already dreaming of reaching the Pacific. They call it manifest destiny. The idea that God himself has chosen Americans to spread from coast to coast to take over every valley, every river, every plain. Every plain. It's not a metaphor, it's a divine order. Or at least that's what they convince themselves. But between them and that dream, there is something they didn't expect to find on the maps. Millions of people already living there. This is the story of how the United States conquered the West. Not the romantic version of hats and golden sunsets, a real version with its heroes, its murderers, its visionaries, and its victims, with the blood that no one wanted to clean up. Part 1. The Promised Land that already had an owner. In 1845, there were approximately 300,000 people of European origin living west of the Mississippi River. At the same time, it is estimated that between 400,000 and 600,000 indigenous people inhabit those same plains, mountains, and deserts. The difference between the two groups is enormous. The indigenous people know every stone in that territory. Newcomers bring a paper signed in Washington, she stating that the land is theirs. Learn O'Sullivan, a journalist from New York, wrote a sentence that would spread across the continent like wildfire. Our manifest destiny is to spread throughout the continent that Providence has assigned to us for the free development of our millions of inhabitants who multiply every year. O'Sullivan never fires a single shot, rides a horse, or crosses any desert. He writes that sentence in an editorial office in Manhattan, and with it justifies decades of violence. To understand what is coming, we must understand what came before. The territory that we know today as the American West is not a vacuum. It is a complex, ancient world, perfectly organized in its own way. The Siouxin people inhabit the Great Plains of the North and have built an entire civilization around the bison. The Comanche control the South with a horsemanship that astounds even the American military. The Apache know every canyon in the desert with a precision that no white map can replicate. The NES Bursay farmed the Northwest with a sophistication that no one recognizes. And dozens more nations live, trade, and war with one another, spending thousands of years adapting to landscapes that would take European decades to learn to read. No one asks what they think of the newcomers, but many of them say it anyway. Bread Cloud, chief or Glalasho Cooks, would say years later that when the whites came to our land, they didn't bring bread, they brought. And when we told our chief, they smiled at us and told us we were free. But free from what? From starving in our own land? In Washington, it was radically different. President James Polk arrives at the White House in 1845. With a clear agenda. He wants Texas. He wants California. He wants Oregon. He wants everything he can get before some other country takes it and he gets it. Texas is annexed in 1845. Oregon is negotiated with the British in 1846. And for what's left, a war has to be invented. Part 2, the war that no one calls an invasion, 1846. The border between Mexico and the United States is a line that no one quite knows where it is. Well, Polk needs an incident, and the incident comes, or at least that's what he says, when a group of Mexican soldiers crosses the Rio Grande and kill both countries claim as their own. Polk appears before Congress and declares that Mexico has spilled American blood on American soil. Congress gives him the resources he asks for. The war begins. Lieutenant Ulysses C. Grant, who fought in that war at a very young age and who decades later led the Union Army in the Civil War, would write in his memoirs that the war with Mexico was one of the most unjust. A strong nation against a weak, foreign. Oh, this when he was already old and could afford to be honest. Mexico signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. It gave the United States what are now Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and parts of Wyoming and Kansas. In exchange, it received dollars, a ridiculous price for half a country. That same year, less than 2 weeks after the treaty was signed, something happened that no one planned for, and that changed everything. On January 9, 1848, a carpenter named James Marshall was building a sawmill in Coloma, California, on the American River. When he saw something shining in the water, he picked it up, examined it, and went to find his boss, John Sutter. They performed the acid test. It was gold, pure gold. Marshall would later say that it was as if the ground beneath my feet had suddenly become different. The same river, the same rocks, the same mud, but they were no longer the same. Sutter tried to keep it a secret, but he failed. By the end of that year, the news had reached San Francisco, New York, London, and Shanghai. And in 1849, 00 people set out for California from all corners of the world. They were called the 49. They arrived by boat around South America. They arrived on foot across the desert. They arrived in rickety wagons on roads that didn't exist. They arrived with picks and shovels and dreams most will never see fulfilled. In less than 2 years, California went from having 14,000 inhabitants of European origin to having more than 200,000. What happened to the indigenous people of California during that period is one of the most brutal stories of the entire century. In 1845, there were approximately 150,000 Native Americans in California. By 1855, there were fewer than 50,000. In 10 years, 100,000 people were murdered and displaced. They died of diseases brought by the newcomers. They were victims of massacres that the state government openly financed. In his speech to the state legislature in 1851, California Governor Peter Burnett said that a war of extermination would continue to be waged between the races until the Native American race became extinct. He said this before the legislature of a state that had just joined the Union as a free state. No one in the room protested. Part 3. The paths that were forged with blood. While California was filled with gold prospectors, the rest of the country looked to west with different eyes. Not everyone was looking for nuggets in the rivers. Many were looking for land. Land to farm, to raise cattle, to leave their children. And the American government had a very clear message for them. Go ahead. Take it. It's yours. The problem is that the trails to that land cross territory that the treaties, at least on paper, still recognize as Indian territory. The Oregon Trail, which begins in Independence, Missouri, and ends 1,900 miles later in the Willamette Valley, crosses Siukas, Cheyenne, Shawnee, and Nespe lands. At first, the migrants passed by and the Indians watched them. Some even trade with them. But when the migrants start to number in the tens of thousands and then hundreds of thousands, the dynamic changes. The bison, the foundation of the entire economy of the Plains nations, begin to dwindle. The herds that the migrants see as they cross are immense, tens of millions of animals, but the wagon trains scare the animals away from their migration routes. The food and the watering holes are polluted by their domestic animals. The Indians see that what is coming is not a wave, it is a tide. The government in Washington tries to manage this with treaties. In 1851 at Fort Laramie, he gathered representatives of the Sioux, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Crow, Shoshone, and other nations. He asked them to define their territories on a map and to promise not to attack immigrants. In exchange, the government promised them $1,000 a year in goods for 50 years. What the Senate later ratified was a different treaty than the one that was signed. The 50-minus-year term became 10. The borders drawn on the map began to shrink almost immediately, and the 50,000 families who crossed the Oregon Trail each year continued to arrive, unstoppable by any treaty. An old Sheen man, whose name translated into English sounds like white elk, would tell an interpreter that the papers our chief signed were not written by us, they were. And when they didn't like something, they said the paper said something else. What can we do against a paper that changes on its own? Part 4. Gold, silver, and the iron locomotive. In 1859, another discovery rocks the country. This time, it's not gold in California. It's silver in Nevada, in what's called the Comstock Seam, and silver and gold together in Colorado, in what they call the Pike Peak Rush. 59 goes to gold. His shout, repeating the year as if it were an incantation. Or Abraham Lincoln signs the Pacific Railway Act. The plan is to build a transcontinental railroad. Union Pacific will build from the east, Central Pacific from the west. They will meet somewhere in the middle. What comes next is a brutal, inhumane, and extraordinary feat of engineering at the same time. Union Pacific pushes further west, hiring a workforce consisting mainly of Civil War veterans and numerous Irish immigrants. Central Pacific pushes east with a workforce that no one expected. 10,000 Chinese laborers, many from Canton province, fall several feet deep. They are paid $8 a month. Less than white workers for the same work and at greater risk. Leland Stanford, one of the magnates behind the Central Pacific, would publicly state that without Chinese labor, the line would have taken 10 more years to complete. He gives them no raise. On May 10, 1869, at Promontory Summit, Utah, the two branches meet. He claims the famous golden spike. The news is relayed by telegraphs across the country in real time. The nation goes wild with celebration. What no one mentions in the speeches is that the railroad line cuts directly through treaty-recognized Indian territory, or that its construction required the systematic elimination of the bison that lived on the plains. Nor that every railroad station built in the West is a new penetration point that the Army can use to advance still further. General William Thaddeus Sherman, who had burned Georgia during the Civil War and who now commanded military operations in the West, understood this perfectly. Sherman wrote in a private letter, that the railroad is the instrument that 50 years. The Indian question. That's what they call the presence of millions of people who lived there before them. Part 5. The Great Buffalo Massacre. To understand what happened in the 1860s and 70s on the Great Plains, you have to understand what the bison meant. These that lived there, thinking the bison was not simply food, it was the entire basis of a civilization. Their meat was made into winter buckskin. Their hides were made into tents, clothing, blankets, shoes, shields, canoes. Their bones were made into tools, needles, knives. Their fat was made into candles and lubricants. Their sinews are made into ropes and bows. Their dried dung is made into fuel. There is hardly any part of the animal that is not used. A group of 50 SOS can survive the harshest winter with a single, well-married herd. In 1850, there were between 30 and 60 million bison on the American plains. It is one of the largest concentrations of mammals the world has ever seen. By 1889, there were fewer than 1,000 left. What happened over those 40 years was one of the most deliberate and systematic exterminations of wildlife in human history. And it was deliberate because the American military decided to do so. General Phil Sheridan, who commanded the forces in the Southwest, explained it bluntly to the Texas Congress when legislators proposed a law to bison, Mrs. K. Mitten. Sheridan told them they were wrong, that killing, skinning, and selling until the buffalo are exterminated. Then the prairies will be covered with cattle and western farmers. They don't pass the law. The hunters come by the thousands. Buffalo Bill Cody, whose real name is William Frederick Cody, Inc. kills 4,280 buffalo in 18 months, working for a railroad company that needs to feed its workers. He becomes a celebrity. They put on a variety show for him. He becomes famous all over the world. The buffalo hides are sold in the East for $3 apiece. The tongues are exported as a delicacy to Europe. The bones are ground up for compost. What's no good is left to rot on the prairie. There are areas of the West where the ground is literally covered for miles with bleached bones. A Comanche warrior named Isatai, known to his people as Whiteback, watches disappear for years. For years. Years later, he would say that when we were children, you could hear the thunder of the herds 2 days before you saw them. They would make the earth tremble, and one day you would wake up and there was no thunder, no earth shaking, there was nothing, just silence. Part 6, The Plains Wars. There's no such thing as a Western war. There are dozens of wars, conflicts, massacres, reprisals, and counter-retaliations that span 30 years. But there are moments that define everything. A beating. November 29, 1864. Sand Creek, Colorado. The Cheyenne chief, Black Kettle, has signed a peace treaty. He has led his band of about 700 people to Sand Creek territory, where the government has told them they will be safe. He has raised an American flag and a white flag over his tent. He believes he has done everything right. Before dawn, Colonel John Chivington arrives with 700 soldiers. Chivington is a Methodist preacher turned soldier. He had said before the battle that all the Indians, big and small, must be killed. Lice make lice. He had said this in front of his men. Many of his men had been drinking. What followed lasted less than 2 hours. Between 150 and 200 people died. Mainly women, children, and old people, because most of the warriors were out hunting it poto. The soldiers mutilated the bodies, took our scalpels and other trophies, and returned to Denver, where they were greeted as heroes. The scalpels were displayed in the local theater during the intermission of a play. Black Kettle survived. He also survived another massacre 4 years later on the Piata River, where Custer attacked his camp at dawn. This time he died.